The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Marcus Williams adjusted his red tunic and straightened his iconic bearskin hat. At 28 years old, he had served as one of the Queen's Guard for 3 years, a position that filled him with immense pride. Growing up in Birmingham, as the son of Jamaican immigrants, Marcus never imagined he would one day stand guard at the most famous palace in the world. The tourists were already gathering, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Marcus had learned early in his service to maintain the stoic expression required of his position, despite the constant chatter, photo requests, and occasional inappropriate behavior from visitors. His training had prepared him for almost everything, but today would test him in ways he never expected. Detective Inspector Richard Thornfield stepped out of his black sedan, surveyed the palace grounds with a mixture of nostalgia and bitterness. At 52, he had recently retired from the Metropolitan Police after 30 years of service, most of it spent climbing the ranks through what he believed was merit and dedication. However, his retirement had not been entirely voluntary. A series of complaints about his conduct, particularly regarding his treatment of minority officers and civilians, had made his position increasingly untenable. The Harnefte had always prided himself on being a traditionalist. He believed in order, hierarchy, and what he called proper British values. In his mind, certain positions should be held by certain types of people. And seeing Marcus in the distinctive red uniform of the Queen's Guard struck him as fundamentally wrong. The palace, in his view, represented centuries of British heritage. That should be preserved in its original form. As tourists milled about taking photographs, Thornfield approached the palace gates with purpose. He had been drinking since noon, though his years of practice meant he carried himself with apparent steadiness. The liquid courage had amplified his existing prejudices and given him the misguided confidence to act on thoughts he usually kept private. Marcus noticed the well-dressed older man approaching before most of the other tourists did. Something about the man's bearing and direct gaze set him apart from the typical visitors. The man walked with authority, like someone accustomed to being obeyed, and his expensive suit suggested he was not just another sights. "Excuse me," Thornfield said loudly, his voice carrying across the courtyard and causing several tourists to turn their heads. "I need to speak with whoever is in charge here. There seems to be some sort of mistake." Marcus remained perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead as his training demanded. The Queen's Guard were famous for their ability to remain motionless and silent, regardless of what happened around them. He had stood firm through rain, snow, and countless attempts by tourists to make him react. This would be no different, he told himself. Thornfield stepped closer, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "I'm talking to you, boy. I'm a retired police detective inspector, and I'm telling you, there's been a mistake here. You clearly don't belong in that uniform." The surrounding tourists began to sense tension. Some continued taking photos, thinking this might be part of some elaborate ceremony they didn't understand. Others stepped back, recognizing that something uncomfortable was unfolding. A few began recording with their phones, sensing they might be witnessing something significant. "I've served this country for 30 years, Thornfield continued, his voice now loud enough to echo off the palace walls. "I've dedicated my life to upholding British law and tradition, and I know what I'm looking at here isn't right. That uniform represents centuries of British heritage, and it should be worn by someone who actually represents British values." Marcus felt his jaw clench slightly, the only outward sign of his internal reaction. He had faced racism before, both in his personal life and during his military service, but never so publicly and never while representing the crown. His training had taught him that the uniform he wore was bigger than any individual, and that maintaining dignity in the face of provocation was part of his sacred duty. The crowd was growing larger now, with people stopping their tours and changing their plans to witness what was clearly becoming a confrontation. Some tourists looked uncomfortable and began to walk away, while others moved closer with their cameras. The atmosphere in the courtyard had shifted from cheerful sightseeing to tense anticipation. Thornfield reached into jacket and pulled out his retired police identification, holding it up for everyone to see. "I have the authority to question what I see here," he announced. "And what I see is someone who has no business wearing the Queen's colors. This is about tradition, about heritage, about maintaining the standards that have made this country." Great. Marcus could hear the whispers starting among the crowd. Some tourists were asking each other what was happening, while others were explaining in hushed tones that they thought the man was challenging the guard's right to be there. The weight of the moment was not lost on Marcus. He understood that his response, or lack thereof, would be watched by hundreds of people and potentially shared around the world. "I'm ordering you to step aside," Thornfield said, moving even closer. To Marcus, "I'm ordering you to remove that uniform and let someone appropriate take your place. I've earned the right to make this demand through my years of service to this country." The palace security had begun to take notice of the disturbance, but they hung back, knowing that interfering too quickly could escalate the situation. They trusted in the training and professionalism of the Queen's Guard, and they knew that Marcus had dealt with difficult situations before, though perhaps none quite like this. Marcus remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled and his expression unchanged. Inside, however, his mind was racing. He thought about his parents, who had worked multiple jobs to give him opportunities they never had. He thought about his grandfather, who had served in the British Army during World War II, fighting for the very freedom that allowed ignorant men like Thornfield to voice their prejudices. He thought about every young person of color who might see this moment and wonder if they, too, belonged in positions of honor and responsibility. The confrontation was far from over, and Marcus knew that whatever happened next would be remembered long after the tourists returned home and the sun set over the palace grounds. The tension in the courtyard was becoming unbearable, where tourists had gathered, forming a semicircle around Marcus and Thornfield, their phones held high to capture every moment. The morning had started like any other, but now it felt like the entire weight of history was pressing down on this single confrontation. Thornfield, emboldened by what he perceived as Marcus's silence as submission, stepped even closer. His breath carried the sharp scent of whiskey, and his face had grown red with increasing agitation. "I can see you heard me, boy. I can see you understand exactly what I'm telling you. Now stop this charade and remove yourself from that position." Marcus had been trained for many scenarios. During his military service and his time as a Queen's Guard, he had learned to handle aggressive tourists, protesters, and even potential security threats. But this situation required a different kind of strength. His commanders had always emphasized that the Queen's Guard represented not just military precision, but the very best of British values: dignity, honor, and unwavering commitment to duty. Among the crowd, Sarah Chen, a journalist from London who had been visiting the palace with her family, recognized that she was witnessing something significant. She had covered stories about racism in British institutions before. She could see that this confrontation was about much more than one man's prejudices. She began taking careful notes while recording on her phone, knowing that the world would want to understand exactly what transpired. "You think you can ignore me?" Thornfield's voice grew louder, causing a small child in the crowd to move closer to her mother. "I'm a representative of British law enforcement. I've served this country with distinction. I have the right to question anyone who claims to represent British traditions when they clearly don't belong." The palace security team had moved closer now, though they remained at a respectful distance. Captain James Morrison, the senior officer on duty, had been watching the situation unfold from his position near the main gate. He had served alongside Marcus for 2 years and knew him to be one of the most dedicated and professional guards in the regiment. Morrison also recognized Thornfield from newspaper reports about controversial police officers who had been forced into early retirement. An elderly British man in the crowd, wearing a military veteran's pin on his jacket, stepped forward slightly. Thomas Fletcher had served in the Royal Navy for 25 years and had seen enough real heroes to recognize one when he saw him. He watched Marcus maintaining his position with perfect military bearing despite the verbal assault, and felt a surge of respect for the young guardsman. "This is disgraceful," Fletcher said quietly to his wife. "That young man is serving with honor, and this drunk fool is making a spectacle of himself. his voice carried just far enough for some nearby tourists to hear, and several nodded in agreement. Thornfield had now moved close enough to Marcus that he was almost touching the guard's uniform. "I'm giving you one final opportunity to do the right thing," he said, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "Remove yourself from this position voluntarily, or I'll be forced to take more direct action." The crowd held its collective breath. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Some tourists continued recording, while others felt uncomfortable about documenting what felt like a deeply personal attack on the young guardsman. Marcus remained motionless, but his mind was working furiously. Thought about the oath he had taken when he joined the Queen's Guard, promising to serve with honor regardless of personal cost. He remembered his training sergeant's words about representing something larger than himself. Most importantly, he thought about the example he was setting for everyone watching, particularly young people who might be facing their own battles against prejudice and discrimination. A young girl, no more than 10 years old, tugged on her father's sleeve. "Dad, why is that man being mean to the soldier?" she asked, in a voice that carried across the suddenly quiet courtyard. Her innocent question seemed to crystallize what everyone was thinking, but few had been willing to say aloud. Thornfield heard the child's question and turned briefly to look at her before returning his attention to Marcus. "I'm not being mean, little girl. I'm trying to preserve something important. This uniform represents centuries of British heritage, and it should be worn by people who actually belong to that heritage." The child's father, a Canadian tourist named David Kim, felt his anger rising. "That's enough," he said firmly, stepping protectively in front of his daughter. "You're upsetting children with your behavior. That guardsman is doing his job with dignity, and you're making a fool of yourself." Other voices in the crowd began to murmur agreement. A group of American tourists started applauding Marcus, recognizing his professionalism in the face of obvious provocation. An older British woman called out, "Shame on you for harassing that young man. He's serving his country with honor." But Thornfield was too far gone to listen to reason. The alcohol, combined with his deep-seated prejudices and the humiliation of his forced retirement, had created a perfect storm of rage and entitlement. "You people don't understand," he shouted at the crowd. "You're tourists. You don't know what it means to preserve British traditions. This is about maintaining standards." Captain Morrison decided it was time to intervene before the situation escalated further. He approached slowly, his own military bearing evident in every step. Morrison was a career soldier who had served in Afghanistan and understood the importance of maintaining discipline, even in difficult circumstances. Sir Morrison addressed Thornfield in a calm but authoritative voice. "I'm going to have to ask you to step back from the guardsmen and lower your voice. You're disrupting a military operation and disturbing the peace." Thornfield spun around to face Morrison, his eyes wild with indignation. "And who are you to tell me what to do? I'm a retired detective inspector. I have more authority here than any of you." Morrison remained calm, his hands clasped behind his back in perfect military posture. "Sir, I'm Captain Morrison, and I'm responsible for security at this post. Regardless of your background, you're currently engaging in behavior that constitutes harassment of a serving member of Her Majesty's Guard." The confrontation had now expanded beyond just Marcus and Thornfield. The crowd had grown to nearly 100 people, and the atmosphere was electric with tension. Social media posts were already beginning to spread across the internet. As tourists shared videos and photos of the unfolding drama, Marcus continued to stand perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead, even as the argument swirled around him. He had become the calm center of a storm of emotions and opinions, representing through his silence and dignity everything that the uniform was meant to embody. His response to this crisis would soon become legendary, but first, the confrontation had to reach its inevitable conclusion. The standoff between Captain Morrison and Thornfield had created a new dynamic in the courtyard. But all eyes remained on Marcus, who continued to maintain his post with unwavering discipline. The crowd had grown even larger, with people abandoning their planned tours to witness what was clearly becoming a defining moment. Thornfield's face had grown increasingly red. His hands were shaking with a combination of alcohol and rage. "You military types stick together, don't you?" he sneered at Morrison. "But I know what I'm seeing here, and I know it's wrong. That uniform has been worn by proper British soldiers for centuries, not by people who don't understand what it means." Morrison remained perfectly calm, his voice steady and professional. "Sir Guardsman Williams has served with distinction in Afghanistan and has been vetted at the highest levels of security clearance. He has earned his position through merit, courage, and dedication to duty. I would ask you to show him the respect that his service deserves." The crowd murmured approval at Morrison's words, but Thornfield was beyond reasoning. The mention of Afghanistan seemed to trigger something deeper in his prejudices: service. He laughed bitterly. "Real service is about understanding tradition, about preserving what makes this country great. It's not about political correctness or diversity quotas." Marcus felt something shift inside him at those words. He thought about the friends he had lost in Afghanistan. Soldiers of all backgrounds who had died fighting for the same flag that flew above the palace where he now stood. He thought about the nights spent on patrol in Helmand province, where the color of a soldier's skin mattered, far less than their willingness to watch their comrades' backs. An unexpected voice joined the conversation. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a historian specializing in British military tradition, had been visiting the palace with her university students when the confrontation began. She stepped forward, her academic credentials lending weight to her words. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Dr. Hartwell said with quiet authority, "but I feel compelled to address some misconceptions being shared here today. The Queen's Guard has a long and noble tradition, but that tradition has always evolved with the times and the needs of the nation." Thornfield turned his attention to her, his expression skeptical. "And you are?" "Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, professor of military history at Cambridge University," she replied calmly. "I've spent 30 years studying the evolution of British military traditions, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that the strength of these institutions has always come from their ability to attract the best people, regardless of their background." The crowd grew quiet, sensing that they were about to hear something important. Dr. Hartwell continued. "The very first Guards regiments included soldiers from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Throughout history, the British military has drawn strength from the diversity of the Commonwealth. To suggest that service and dedication can be determined by ethnicity is not only morally wrong, it's historically ignorant." Thornfield's face twisted with anger. "That's academic nonsense. I lived in the real world for 30 years. I know what works and what doesn't." "The real world?" Dr. Hartwell's voice remained calm, but carried a hint of steel. "The real world where Guardsman Williams served multiple tours in Afghanistan, earning commendations for bravery under fire? The real world where he passed the same rigorous selection process as every other guard, meeting the exact same standards of physical fitness, mental toughness, and moral character?" Marcus felt a surge of gratitude toward the professor, but he maintained his rigid posture and neutral expression. His training had taught him that speaking out of turn would not only break protocol, but could also escalate the situation further. He trusted that the truth would eventually prevail. He was beginning to see that happening through the words and actions of others. A veteran in the crowd, still wearing his service medals on his jacket, stepped forward. "I served 22 years in the parachute regiment," he announced in a voice that commanded attention. "I've seen courage in all colors and cowardice in all colors. That young guardsman has shown more discipline and professionalism in the last 20 minutes than most people show in a lifetime." Other veterans in the crowd began to nod and voice their agreement. The tourists, many of whom had come to London to see the famous pageantry of British tradition, were witnessing something far more profound than they had expected. They were seeing those traditions being both challenged and defended in real time. Thornfield was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. The crowd was turning against him. Even his claimed authority as a former police officer was being questioned by people with genuine military credentials. In his desperation, he made a decision that would seal his fate. "I don't care what any of you say," he shouted, moving closer to Marcus again. "I'm going to settle this myself." He reached out his hand toward Marcus's uniform, apparently intending to physically remove some part of it. The moment Thornfield's hand moved toward Marcus, Several things happened simultaneously. Captain Morrison stepped forward quickly, ready to physically intervene if necessary. The crowd gasped collectively, and several people shouted warnings. But most significantly, Marcus finally broke his silence. "Sir," Marcus said in a clear, calm voice that carried across the entire courtyard, "I would respectfully ask you to step back." The power of those simple words was extraordinary. After 20 minutes of remaining perfectly silent while enduring verbal abuse and threats, Marcus had finally spoken. But his tone was not angry or confrontational. It was measured, respectful, and utterly professional. The contrast between his dignity and Thornfield's increasingly erratic behavior was stark and undeniable. Thornfield stopped short, apparently surprised that Marcus had finally responded. "So you can speak," he said with a bitter laugh. "I was beginning to think you were just a statue they put in a uniform." Marcus looked directly at Thornfield for the first time, his eyes meeting the older man's gaze with steady confidence. "Sir, I have maintained my position because that is my duty. I have remained silent because that is what protocol requires. But I will not allow you to physically interfere with my service to the crown." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Social media posts were spreading rapidly as people shared videos of the confrontation, and news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. But in that moment, in that courtyard, everything came down to two men representing very different visions. Of what Britain could be, your duty? Thornfield's voice dripped with contempt. Your duty is to recognize when you don't belong somewhere and remove yourself accordingly. Marcus took a barely perceptible breath before delivering the response. That would end the confrontation and make him famous around the world. Marcus looked directly into Thornfield's eyes, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction and unshakable dignity. The entire courtyard fell silent, as if everyone present understood they were about to witness something that would be remembered for generations. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice clear and measured, "I belong here because I earned the right to be here. I belong here because I took the same oath as every guardsman before me, swearing to serve with honor regardless of personal cost. Here because I've proven my courage under fire, not in arguments with tourists, but in service to this nation in Afghanistan, where I lost friends defending the freedom that allows you to stand here today and voice your opinions." The power of his words seemed to ripple through the crowd like electricity. The people who had been taking photos stopped to listen. Children who had been restless grew quiet. Even the pigeons seemed to pause in their pecking at crumbs on the cobblestones. Marcus continued, his posture remaining perfect, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. "I belong here because Her Majesty's Army judged me worthy based on my character, skill, and my dedication, not on the color of my skin or the country where my grandparents were born. I belong here because I believe in what this uniform represents. Service above self, duty above comfort, and honor above personal advancement." The clarity and dignity of Marcus's response had completely undermined every argument he had made. "But most importantly, sir," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength, "I belong here because belonging isn't something that's given by people like you or taken away by people like you. Belonging is earned through service, through sacrifice, and through keeping faith with the values that make this nation worth defending. And those values include the belief that any person, regardless of their background, can rise to serve something greater than themselves if they're willing to pay the price in dedication and honor." Dr. Hartwell felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to Marcus speak. In 30 years of studying military tradition, she had rarely heard those traditions articulated with such clarity and power. This young guardsman was not just defending his right to wear the uniform, it was defining what the uniform truly meant. The veteran with the service medals began to applaud, slowly and deliberately. Here, he said firmly. "That's what service sounds like." Others in the crowd joined in, until the entire courtyard was filled with the sound of applause for Marcus's words. Thornfield looked around at the crowd, suddenly seeming to realize how completely he had been outmaneuvered. His face, already red from alcohol and anger, grew even redder as he understood that every person present was now against him. The phones recording the confrontation would carry his humiliation around the world within hours. "This is political correctness gone mad," he muttered, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "This is not the Britain I served." Marcus nodded respectfully.
"You're right, sir."
"This is not the Britain you served. This is the Britain you served to create. This is the Britain where a young man from Birmingham, whose grandparents came here, seeking opportunity, can stand guard at the palace of our sovereign. This is the Britain where service and character matter more than ancestry. This is the Britain worth fighting for." Captain Morrison stepped forward, his respect for Marcus evident in his posture. "Guardsman Williams," he said formally, "you have conducted yourself with exceptional professionalism under difficult circumstances. Your response reflects the highest traditions of the regiment." The crowd's applause grew louder. Someone called out, "God save the Queen," and others took up the cry. What had begun as an ugly confrontation had transformed into a celebration of the best of British values. Thornfield seemed to deflate as he realized he had lost not just the argument, but any remaining shred of dignity he might have possessed. The man who had approached the palace that morning, believing he had the authority to challenge, the Guard's right to serve, had been thoroughly exposed as representing everything the Guard stood against. "I want to speak to someone in charge," Thornfield said weakly, his voice barely audible over the continued applause. Morrison smiled slightly. "Sir, you've been speaking to someone in charge. Guardsman Williams is in charge of his post, and he has executed his duties flawlessly. As for higher authority, I believe Her Majesty the Queen would be quite proud of how her guardsman has conducted himself today." A reporter who had arrived during the confrontation pushed forward with her microphone. "Guardsman Williams, how did you find the strength to respond so eloquently to such provocation?" Marcus resumed his position of attention, looking straight ahead once again. "Ma'am, I was simply doing my duty. The uniform I wear represents something larger than any individual. It was my honor to defend what it stands for." The reporter turned to Thornfield. "Detective Inspector Thornfield, would you like to respond to the guardsman's statement?" Thornfield looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him. At the phone still recording his humiliation. At the young guardsman who had so thoroughly demolished his prejudices with nothing but truth and dignity. For the first time that morning, he seemed to understand the magnitude of his mistake. I think I should go," he mumbled, pushing through the crowd toward the street. But his ordeal was far from over. The videos of the confrontation were already going viral on social media, and his name and face would soon be known around the world, forever associated with this moment of shame. As Thornfield disappeared into the London crowd, the tourists began to disperse, but many lingered to take photos with Marcus, who had returned to his silent, stoic duty. Children asked their parents to explain what had happened, and the parents found themselves discussing complex issues of racism, service, and national identity. Dr. Hartwell approached Captain Morrison before leaving. "Captain, I hope you'll ensure that Guardsman Williams knows that what he did today will be studied and admired for years to come. Didn't just defend his right to serve. He defined what service means in the modern world." Morrison nodded. "The Guardsman will be properly recognized for his conduct, both through official channels and through the respect of everyone who witnessed his performance today." As the morning sun climbed higher over Buckingham Palace, Marcus Williams continued. His duty, standing guard over the symbols of a nation that was still learning to live up to its highest ideals. His quiet victory would resonate far beyond the palace grounds, inspiring others to stand firm in the face of prejudice and to believe in their right to serve something greater than themselves. Within hours of the confrontation, the videos taken by tourists began spreading across social media platforms at an incredible pace. The hashtag Guardsman Williams was trending worldwide, with millions of people sharing clips of Marcus's dignified response to Thornfield's racist tirade. News outlets from London to New York to Sydney picked up the story. Marcus found himself at the center of an international conversation about racism, service, and what it truly means to represent one's country. The first major news report appeared on BBC News at noon, just 2 hours after the confrontation ended. The anchor introduced the story by saying, "A video showing a confrontation between a retired police officer and a Queen's Guard has gone viral today, sparking conversations about racism and military service across the Commonwealth." The journalist who had witnessed the entire event published a detailed account on her news website that provided crucial context, often missing from the shorter video clips. Her article, titled "The Guardsman Who Reminded Britain of Its Best Self," included interviews with several witnesses and provided background on both Marcus's military service and Thornfield's troubled final years with the Metropolitan Police. His modest flat in Birmingham, Marcus's parents, Winston and Jennifer Williams, watched the news coverage with a mixture of pride and concern. Winston, who worked as a bus driver, had always worried about his son facing racism in the military. Jennifer, a nurse at the local hospital, had spent years watching her son excel, despite obstacles that others never had to face. "He handled that beautifully," Jennifer said, wiping tears from her eyes as she watched her son's measured response on the television screen. "But I worry about all this attention. Marcus just wants to serve quietly." Winston nodded, his own eyes moist with pride. "He's always been like that. Even as a boy, when the other kids would tease him, he never lost his temper. He would just stand tall and speak his truth." The phone in their flat had been ringing constantly since the story broke. Reporters from around the world wanted interviews with the parents of the guardsman who had so eloquently defended not just his own right to serve, but the principles of equality and merit that many believed were fundamental to modern Britain. At Scotland Yard, Commissioner Helen Davies was dealing with a different kind of crisis. Thornfield's behavior at the palace had reopened questions about the culture within the Metropolitan Police, particularly regarding how officers from minority backgrounds were treated. The fact that a retired detective inspector felt comfortable making such openly racist statements in public suggested deeper problems within the organization. Davies called an emergency meeting with her senior staff. "This incident reflects poorly on every officer who has ever worn the uniform," she told them. "We need to understand how someone like Thornfield was allowed to serve for 30 years while holding such views. And we need to ensure that current officers understand that this behavior is completely unacceptable." The investigation into Thornfield's past conduct was swift and thorough. Several former colleagues came forward to describe incidents where Thornfield had made racist comments or treated non-white officers with obvious bias. The pattern painted a picture of an institution that had failed to address systemic problems for decades. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, Marcus was struggling to adjust to his sudden fame while continuing to perform his duties. Captain Morrison had arranged for additional security to manage the crowds of tourists, now came specifically hoping to see the famous guardsman. Media requests for interviews poured in, but Marcus declined them all, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. The royal family's response came through official channels 3 days after the incident. Statement from Buckingham Palace. Read, "Her Majesty's household guards represent the finest traditions of military service, duty, and honor. The Queen has full confidence in all members of her guard, who serve with distinction regardless of their background." While the statement was carefully worded and diplomatic, those familiar with royal protocol understood it as a strong endorsement of Marcus and a clear rebuke of Thornfield's behavior. The fact that the palace had issued any statement at all about the incident was significant, as the royal family typically remains silent on political controversies. The impact of the incident extended far beyond Britain. In Australia, where debates about multiculturalism and national identity were ongoing, Marcus's response was cited by politicians and commentators as an example of how diversity could strengthen rather than weaken national institutions. In Canada, the story sparked discussions about the treatment of Indigenous soldiers and the need for military organizations to better reflect the populations they serve. In the United States, where similar debates about race and patriotism were particularly intense, Marcus's measured response was contrasted favorably with more confrontational approaches to addressing racism. Several American military leaders referenced his handling of the situation in speeches about leadership and professional conduct under pressure. Dr. Hartwell found herself in high demand as a commentator on the historical significance of the incident. In interviews with multiple news outlets, she consistently emphasized that Marcus's response had not only defended his right to serve, but had articulated a vision of national identity based on values rather than ethnicity. "What Guardsman Williams did," she told one interviewer, was to remind us that true patriotism isn't about excluding others, but about upholding the principles that make exclusion impossible. He didn't just defend his right to wear the uniform. He defined what the uniform should represent in the 21st century. The incident also had profound effects on young people across Britain and the Commonwealth. Schools reported increased interest in military careers among minority students. Youth organizations noted more diverse participation in programs focused on citizenship and community service. Marcus had become an unintentional role model, demonstrating that dignity and principle could triumph over prejudice and hatred. At military academies and training facilities, Marcus's response was studied as an example of how to maintain professional standards while addressing inappropriate behavior. His ability to remain calm under pressure, to articulate complex ideas clearly, and to defend important principles without descending to personal attacks became a case study in leadership education. The psychological impact on Marcus himself was complex. While he appreciated the support and recognition, he remained focused on his duty as a guardsman. He had never sought fame or attention. He had simply wanted to serve his country with honor. The global spotlight was uncomfortable for someone who had always preferred to let his actions speak louder than his words in quiet moments between his duties. He understood that his response had resonated with so many people because it had articulated feelings and beliefs that many held but struggled to express. In a world where discussions about race and identity often generated more heat than light, his calm, principled response had offered a different way forward. 6 months after the confrontation at Buckingham Palace, the ripple effects of that morning continued to reshape conversations about race, service, and national identity across Britain and beyond. Marcus Williams had returned to his quiet life as a Queen's Guard, but the world around him had changed in subtle yet significant ways. The most immediate change was at the palace itself. Tourism had increased dramatically, with many visitors coming specifically to see the location where Marcus had made his stand. The palace gift shop had even begun selling postcards featuring images of the Queen's Guard with quotes about duty and service, though Marcus had specifically requested that his name not be used in any commercial materials for Richard Thornfield. The months following his public humiliation had been devastating. The viral videos of his racist tirade had made him unemployable and unwelcome in most social circles. His pension remained intact, but his reputation was permanently destroyed. Several former colleagues from the Metropolitan Police had publicly distanced themselves from him, with some revealing that they had complained about his behavior years earlier, but had been ignored by superiors. Thornfield's wife of 25 years had left him 3 months after the incident, taking their 2 adult children with her emotional support. In a brief statement to the press, she had said, "I can no longer stand by someone whose values are so fundamentally opposed to everything I believe about human dignity and equality." Living alone in a small flat in South London, Thornfield spent his days drinking and watching the news coverage of the incident that had destroyed his life. He had been approached by several far-right groups who wanted to use him as a symbol of their cause. But even in his bitterness, he had enough sense to reject their overtures. The Metropolitan Police had used the incident as a catalyst for comprehensive reform. Commissioner Davies had implemented new training programs focused on unconscious bias and cultural sensitivity. Officers were now required to complete annual workshops on community relations, and the promotion system had been overhauled to ensure that candidates' attitudes toward diversity were carefully evaluated. Detective Constable Priya Patel, one of A. Thornfield's former colleagues, had been promoted to detective inspector partly as a result of the reforms. She had been one of the officers who had filed complaints about Thornfield's behavior years earlier, only to see them buried in bureaucratic procedures. Now she was leading the new community relations unit, working to rebuild trust between the police and minority communities. The Thornfield incident was a wake-up call for all of us, she told a gathering of community leaders. Forced us to confront the fact that good intentions aren't enough. We need systems and structures that actively promote equality and inclusion, not just policies that prohibit obvious discrimination. At Cambridge University, Dr. Hartwell had been invited to deliver a series of lectures on military tradition and modern values that drew packed audiences from across Britain and Europe. Her analysis of the palace incident had become required, reading in military academies and police training colleges throughout the Commonwealth. What made Guardsman Williams's response so powerful, she explained to her students, was that he didn't reject tradition. Instead, he redefined it. He showed that true tradition isn't about excluding people who are different, but about upholding the values that make inclusion possible. Marcus himself had been quietly promoted to Lance Corporal, a recognition of both his exemplary service and his handling of the confrontation. He continued to decline most interview requests, though he had agreed to speak at a few military academies and youth organizations. His message was always the same. Service is about something larger than yourself. Dignity is maintained through actions, not words. One of his most impactful appearances had been at a secondary school in Birmingham, not far from where he had grown up, speaking to an assembly of teenagers, many of whom came from immigrant families like his own. Marcus had emphasized that belonging in Britain wasn't about where your grandparents were born, but about what you were willing to contribute to the nation's future. Every country needs people who are willing to serve something greater than their own interests. He had told the students that service can take many forms. It can be in the military, in healthcare, in education, in community work, or in 1,000 other ways. What matters is that you find a way to give back to the country that has given you opportunities. After his talk, a young British-Pakistani girl had approached him with tears in her eyes. "My father says I can't join the military because people like us don't belong there," she had said. "But after seeing what you did, I think maybe he's wrong." Marcus had knelt down to her level, his voice gentle but firm. "Your father loves you and wants to protect you from hurt," he had said. "But you have the same rights and opportunities as anyone else in this country. If you want to serve and you're willing to earn your place through hard work and dedication, then you belong wherever you choose to go." The girl had gone on to join the combined cadet force at her school. Her story had become part of the larger narrative about how Marcos's example was inspiring a new generation of young people to see themselves as full participants in British society. The international impact of the incident had been equally significant. Military leaders from around the world had studied the confrontation as an example of how to handle racist behavior with professionalism and dignity. The video of Marcus's response had been translated into dozens of languages and was used in training programs from NATO headquarters to military academies in developing nations. In South Africa, where the military was still working to overcome the legacy of apartheid, Marcus's words about earning belonging through service had resonated particularly strongly. In Australia, his example had been cited in debates about Indigenous representation in national institutions. In Canada, his approach had influenced discussions about how to address racism in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The incident had also sparked academic research into the psychology of dignity under pressure. Several universities had launched studies examining why Marcus's calm response had been so much more effective than more confrontational approaches to addressing racism. The preliminary findings suggested that his combination of moral authority, factual accuracy, and emotional restraint had created what researchers called irrefutable dignity that made it impossible for reasonable people to dismiss his message. As the first anniversary of the confrontation approached, Marcus continued his duties at Buckingham Palace with the same quiet professionalism that had always characterized his service. The crowds of tourists still gathered to see him, but he had learned to tune out the whispers and pointing. He remained focused on his duty, knowing that his true legacy wasn't the viral video or the global recognition, but the example he had set for others facing similar challenges. On quiet nights when he had time to reflect, Marcus thought about the letter he had received from a young British-Jamaican soldier serving in Afghanistan. The soldier had written that watching Marcus's response had given him the courage to report racist behavior in his own unit, leading to positive changes in his battalion's culture. "You showed all of us that we don't have to accept disrespect in silence," the soldier had written. "But you also showed us that the most powerful response is to embody the values we want to see in the world. Thank you for reminding us that dignity is a choice we make every day." That letter, more than any newspaper article or television interview, had convinced Marcus that the uncomfortable spotlight of that morning at the palace had been worth it. He had not chosen to become a symbol, but he had chosen to respond with honor when the moment demanded it. In doing so, he had reminded an entire nation of what it could be at its best, as he stood guard outside Buckingham Palace on a crisp autumn morning. Marcus Williams embodied the quiet strength that had always been at the heart of the British military tradition. He had proven that true authority comes not from the power to exclude others, but from the courage to include them in something worth defending. His calm reply to hatred had not just ended one man's racist tirade, but had helped end an era when such attitudes could go unchallenged in the institutions meant to serve all citizens equally.